Chapter I. The problem. The present Russian Revolution has, for the first time in the history of the world, made a socialist party the rulers of a great empire. A far more powerful event than the seizing of control of the town of Paris by the proletariat in 1871. Yet, in one important aspect, the Paris Commune was superior to the Soviet Republic. The former was the work of the entire proletariat. All shades of the socialist movement took part in it, none drew back from it, none was excluded. On the other hand, the Socialist Party which governs Russia today gained power in fighting against other socialist parties, and exercises its authority while excluding other socialist parties from the executive. The antagonism of the two socialist movements is not based on small personal jealousies, it is the clashing of two fundamentally distinct methods, that of democracy and that of dictatorship. Both movements have the same end in view, to free the proletariat, and with it humanity, through socialism. But the view taken by the one is held by the other to be erroneous and likely to lead to destruction. It is impossible to regard so gigantic an event as the proletarian struggle in Russia without taking sides. Each of us feels impelled to violent partisanship. And the more so because the problem which today occupies our Russian comrades will tomorrow assume practical significance for Western Europe, and does already decisively influence the character of our propaganda and tactics. It is, however, our party duty not to decide for one or the other side in the Russian internal quarrel before we have thoroughly tested the arguments of both. In this many comrades would hinder us. They declare it to be our duty blindly to pronounce in favor of the section now at the helm. Any other attitude would endanger the revolution, and socialism itself. This is nothing less than to ask us to accept as already proved that which is still to be examined, viz., that one of the sections has struck out in the right path, and we must encourage it by following. We place ourselves, of course, by asking for the fullest discussion, already on the ground of democracy. Dictatorship does not ask for the refutation of contrary views, but the forcible suppression of their utterance. Thus, the two methods of democracy and dictatorship are already irreconcilably opposed before the discussion has started. The one demands, the other forbids it. In the meantime, dictatorship does not yet reign in our party, discussion amongst us is still free. And we consider it not only as our right, but as our duty to express our opinions freely, because an appropriate and fruitful decision is only possible after hearing all the arguments. One man's speech is notoriously no man's speech. Both sides must be listened to. We will, therefore, examine the significance which democracy has for the proletariat, what we understand by the dictatorship of the proletariat, and what conditions dictatorship, as a form of government, creates in the struggle for freedom of the proletariat. Chapter 2. Democracy and the conquest of political power. The distinction is sometimes drawn between democracy and socialism, that is, the socialization of the means of production and of production, by saying that the latter is our goal, the object of our movement, while democracy is merely the means to this end, which occasionally might become unsuitable, or even a hindrance. To be exact, however, socialism as such is not our goal, which is the abolition of every kind of exploitation and oppression, be it directed against a class, a party, a sex, or a race. We seek to achieve this object by supporting the proletarian class struggle, because the proletariat, being the undermost class, cannot free itself without abolishing all causes of exploitation and oppression, and because the industrial proletariat, of all the oppressed and exploited classes, is the one which constantly grows in strength, fighting capacity, and inclination to carry on the struggle, its ultimate victory being inevitable. Therefore, today every genuine opponent of exploitation and oppression must take part in the class struggle, from whatever class he may come. If in this struggle we place the socialist way of production as the goal, it is because in the technical and economic conditions which prevail today socialistic production appears to be the sole means of attaining our object. Should it be proved to us that we are wrong in so doing, and that somehow the emancipation of the proletariat and of mankind could be achieved solely on the basis of private property, or could be most easily realized in the manner indicated by Proudhon, then we would throw socialism overboard, without in the least giving up our object, and even in the interests of this object. Socialism and democracy are therefore not distinguished by the one being the means and the other the end. Both are means to the same end. The distinction between them must be sought elsewhere. Socialism as a means to the emancipation of the proletariat, without democracy, is unthinkable. Social production, it is true, is also possible in a system other than a democratic one. In primitive conditions, communistic methods became the basis of despotism, as Engels noted in 1875, when dealing with the village communism which has existed in India and Russia down to our own day. Dutch colonial policy in Java for a long time based the organization of agricultural production under the so-called culture system upon land communism for the profit of the government who exploited the people. The most striking example of a non-democratic organization of social work was furnished in the 18th century by the Jesuit state of Paraguay. There the Jesuits, as the ruling class, organized with dictatorial power the labor of the native Indian population, in a truly admirable fashion, without employing force, and even gaining the attachment of their subjects. For modern men, however, such a patriarchal regime would be intolerable. It is only possible under circumstances where the rulers are vastly superior to the ruled in knowledge, and where the latter are absolutely unable to raise themselves to an equal standard. A section or class which is engaged in a struggle for freedom cannot regard such a system of tutelage as its goal, but must decisively reject it. For us, therefore, socialism without democracy is unthinkable. We understand by modern socialism not merely social organization of production, but democratic organization of society as well. Accordingly, socialism is for us inseparably connected with democracy. No socialism without democracy. But this proposition is not equally true if reversed. Democracy is quite possible without socialism. A pure democracy is even conceivable apart from socialism, for example, in small peasant communities, where complete equality of economic conditions for everybody exists on the basis of participating in privately owned means of production. In any case, it may be said that democracy is possible without socialism, and precedes it. It is this pre-socialist democracy which is apparently in the minds of those who consider that democracy and socialism are related to each other as the means to an end, although they mostly hasten to add that, strictly speaking, it is really no means to an end. This interpretation must be most emphatically repudiated, because, should it win general acceptance, it would lead our movement into most dangerous tracks. Why would democracy be an unsuitable meant for the achievement of socialism? It is a question of the conquest of political power. It is said that if in a hitherto bourgeois democratic state the possibility exists of the social democrats becoming the majority at an election, the ruling classes would make use of all the forces at their command in order to prevent democracy asserting itself. Therefore, it is not by democracy, but only by a political revolution that the proletariat can conquer the political power. Doubtless, in cases where the proletariat of a democratic state attains to power, one must reckon with attempts of the ruling classes to nullify by violence the realization of democracy by the rising class. This, however, does not prove the worthlessness of democracy for the proletariat. Should a ruling class, under the suppositions here discussed, resort to force, it would do so precisely because it feared the consequences of democracy. And its violence would be nothing but the subversion of democracy. Therefore, not the uselessness of democracy for the proletariat is demonstrated by anticipated attempts of the ruling classes to destroy democracy, but rather the necessity for the proletariat to defend democracy with tooth and nail. Of course, if the proletariat is told that democracy is a useless ornament, the needful strength for its defense will not be created. The mass of the people are everywhere too attached to their political rights willingly to abandon them. On the contrary, it is rather to be expected that they would defend their rights with such vigor that if the other side endeavored to destroy the people's privileges, a political overthrow would be the result. The higher the proletariat values democracy, and the closer is its attachment to its rights, the more may one anticipate this course of events. On the other hand, it must not be thought that the forebodings above mentioned will everywhere be realized. We need not be so faint-hearted. The more democratic the state is, the more dependent are the forces exerted by the executive, even the military ones, on public opinion. These forces may become, even in a democracy, a means of holding down the proletarian movement, if the proletariat is still weak in numbers, as in an agrarian state, or if it is politically weak, because unorganized and lacking self-consciousness. But if the proletariat in a democratic state grows until it is numerous and strong enough to conquer political power by making use of the liberties which exist, then it would be a task of great difficulty for the capitalist dictatorship to manipulate the force necessary for the suppression of democracy. As a matter of fact, Marx thought it possible, and even probable, that in England and America the proletariat might peacefully conquer political power. On the conclusion of the Congress of the International at The Hague in 1872, Marx spoke at a meeting, and among other things said, "The worker must one day capture political power in order to found a new organization of labor. He must reverse the old policy, which the old institutions maintain. If he will not, like the Christians of old who despised and neglected such things, renounce the things of this world." But we do not assert that the way to reach this goal is the same everywhere. We know that the institutions, the manners, and the customs of the various countries must be considered, and we do not deny that there are countries like England and America, and, if I understood your arrangements better, I might even add Holland, where the worker may attain his object by peaceful means. But not in all countries is this the case. It remains to be seen whether Marx's expectations will be realized. There are certainly in the above-named countries sections of the ruling classes whose inclinations to use force against the proletariat grow. But, beside these there are other sections in whom the rising power of the proletariat gains respect and evokes a desire to keep it in good humor by concessions. Although the World War, for the period of its duration, has strictly confined the struggle of the masses for freedom everywhere, it has brought to the English proletariat a considerable extension of political power. It cannot today be foreseen how democracy in the various states will influence the forms which the conquest of political power by the proletariat will take, and how far it will avert the use of violent methods from both sides and promote the use of peaceful means. In any case, the institution of democracy would not lose its importance. In a democratic republic, where the people's rights have been firmly established for decades, perhaps centuries, rights which the people conquered by revolution, and maintained or extended, thus compelling the respect of the ruling classes for the masses, in such a community the forms of transition would certainly be different from those in a state where a military despotism has been accustomed to rule by force, and hold the masses of the people in check. For us the significance of democracy in the pre-socialist period is not exhausted with the influence it may have on the forms of transition to a proletarian regime. It is most important for us during this period, insofar as it bears on the ripening of the proletariat. Chapter 3. Democracy and the ripening of the proletariat. Socialism postulates special historical conditions, which render it possible and necessary. This is pretty generally recognized. Yet there is by no means unanimity amongst us as regards the conditions which must be fulfilled in order to make modern socialism possible, should a country be ripe for it. This divergence on such an important question is not a calamity, and so far as it causes us to be occupied with the problem at the present time is a matter for rejoicing. We are obliged to consider this matter because, for most of us, socialism has ceased to be something that must be expected in hundreds of years, as we were assured by many at the time of the outbreak of war. Socialism has become a practical question on the order of the day. What, then, are the prerequisites for the establishment of socialism? Every conscious human action presupposes a will. The will to socialism is the first condition for its accomplishment. This will is created by the great industry. Where small production is uppermost in a society, the masses of the people are possessors of the means of production. He who happens to be without property conceives his ideal to be the acquirement of a small possession. This desire may, in some circumstances, assume a revolutionary form, but such a social revolution would not have a socialist character. It would only redistribute the existing wealth in such a manner that everyone would receive a share. Small production always creates the will to uphold or to obtain private property in the means of production which are in vogue, not the will to social property, to socialism. This will first appears amongst the masses when large-scale industry is already much developed, and its superiority over small production is unquestioned, when it would be a retrograde step, if it were possible, to break up large-scale industry when the workers engaged in the large industry cannot obtain a share in the means of production unless they take on a social form, when small production, so far as it exists, steadily deteriorates, so that the small producers can no longer support themselves thereby. In this way the will to socialism grows. At the same time, the material possibilities of its achievement increase with the growth of the large industry. The larger the number of producers, and the more independent of each other they are, the more difficult it is to organize them socially. This difficulty disappears in the measure in which the number of producers decreases, and the relations between them become more close and uniform. Finally, alongside of the will to socialism, and its material conditions, the raw material of socialism, the strength to realize it must also exist. Those who want socialism must become stronger than those who do not want it. This factor, too, is created by the development of the large industry, which causes an increase in the number of proletarians, those who have an interest in socialism, and a decrease in the number of capitalists, that is a decrease as compared with the number of proletarians. In comparison with the non-proletarian classes, the small peasants and petty bourgeoisie, the number of capitalists may increase for some time. But the proletariat increases more rapidly than any other class in the state. These factors are the direct outcome of the economic development. They do not arise of themselves, without human cooperation, but they arise without proletarian cooperation, solely through the operations of the capitalists, who have an interest in the growth of their large industry. This development is in the first place industrial, and confined to the towns. The agrarian development is only a weak echo of it. Socialism will come from the towns and from industry, but not from agriculture. For its realization yet another, a fourth, factor is needful besides those already mentioned. The proletariat must not only have an interest in the establishment of socialism, it must not merely have the material conditions for socialism ready to hand, and possess the strength to make use of them, it must also have the capacity to retain its hold of them, and properly to employ them. Only then can socialism be realized as a permanent method of production. To the ripening of the conditions, the necessary level of the industrial development, must be added the maturity of the proletariat, in order to make socialism possible. This factor will not, however, be created by the efforts of the capitalist to obtain rent, interest, and profit, without the cooperation of the proletariat. It must, on the contrary, be obtained by the exertions of the proletariat in opposition to the capitalist. Under the system of small production, those without property fall into two sections. For one of them, viz., apprentices and peasants' sons, their lack of property is only a temporary condition. The members of this class expect one day to become possessors and have an interest in private property. The other section of the class without property are the vagabonds, who are unnecessary and even harmful parasites on society, without education, without self-consciousness, without cohesion. When a chance offers itself, they are quite ready to expropriate the possessors, but they neither want nor are able to construct a new social order. The capitalist method of production makes use of this propertyless class of vagabonds, whose numbers assume large proportions in the beginning of the capitalist system? Out of superfluous, even dangerous parasites, they are transformed into the indispensable economic foundations of production, and therefore of society. Capitalism increases their numbers and multiplies their strength, but it exploits their ignorance, rawness, and incapacity. It even seeks to depress the working classes to their level. By overwork, monotony and dullness of toil, labor of women and children, capitalism even presses the working classes below the level of the former vagabond class. The impoverishment of the proletariat increases in an alarming degree. From it, however, the first striving towards socialism appears as an effort to make an end of the growing poverty of the masses. It seemed, however, that this poverty must render the proletariat forever incapable of emancipating itself. Bourgeois sympathy must save it, and bring socialism about. It is soon apparent that nothing can be expected from this sympathy. Sufficient strength to accomplish socialism can only be expected from those whose interests lie that way, that is the proletarians. But were not they perishing without hope? Not all, in fact. There were particular sections which had shown strength and courage to fight against poverty. This small fraction would do what the utopians were not capable of doing. By a sudden stroke it would capture the powers of the state, and bring socialism to the people. This was the conception of Blanqui and Weitling. The proletariat, which was too ignorant and demoralized to organize and rule itself, should be organized and ruled by a government comprised of its educated elite, something like the Jesuits in Paraguay who had organized and governed the Indians. Weitling foresaw the dictatorship of a single person, who would carry through socialism at the head of a victorious revolutionary army. He called him a messiah. I see a new messiah coming with the sword, to carry into effect the teachings of the first. By his courage he will be placed at the head of the revolutionary army, and with its help he will crumble the decayed structure of the old social order, and drown the sources of tears in the ocean of forgetfulness, and transform the earth into a paradise. Guarantees of harmony and freedom. A generous and enthusiastic anticipation. It is based, however, solely upon the expectation that the revolutionary army will find the right man. But suppose one is not disposed to accept this belief in a coming Messiah, and holds the conviction that unless the proletariat can free itself, socialism must remain an utopia? In view of the fact that the proletariat has not attained to the capacity for self-government in any of the organizations with which it is concerned, is not the hopelessness of socialism, in face of the impoverishment of the workers by capitalism, thereby demonstrated? So it would appear. Yet practice and theory soon showed a way out. In England the industrial proletariat first became a mass movement. There it found some installment of democratic rights, some possibilities of organization and of propaganda, and was stirred into motion by being summoned to the aid of the bourgeoisie in the struggle with the nobles for the franchise. Among the trade unions and the Chartists the beginnings of the labor movement first arose, with the resistance offered by the proletariat to its impoverishment and disfranchisement. It commenced its strikes, and its great fight for the suffrage and the normal working day. Marx and Engels early recognized the significance of this movement. It was not the theory of impoverishment which characterized Marx and Engels. They held this in common with other socialists, but were superior to them by not only recognizing the capitalist tendency towards impoverishment, but also the proletarian counter-tendency, and in the class struggle, they recognized the great factor which would uplift proletariat, and give it the capacity which it needs if it is not merely to grasp political power by the luck of an accident, but is to be in a position to make itself master of that power, and to use it. The proletarian class struggle, as a struggle of the masses, presupposes democracy. If not absolute and pure democracy, yet so much of democracy as is necessary to organize manies, and give them uniform enlightenment. This cannot be adequately done by secret methods. A few fly sheets cannot be a substitute for an extensive daily press. Masses cannot be organized secretly, and, above all, a secret organization cannot be a democratic one. It always leads to the dictatorship of a single man, or of a small knot of leaders. The ordinary members can only become instruments for carrying out orders. Such a method may be rendered necessary for an oppressed class in the absence of democracy, but it would not promote the self-government and independence of the masses. Rather would it further the messiah consciousness of leaders, and their dictatorial habits. The same Weitling, who gave such prominence to the function of a messiah, spoke most contemptuously of democracy. Communists are still pretty undecided about the choice of their form of government. A large part of those in France incline to a dictatorship, because they well know that the sovereignty of the people, as understood by Republicans and politicians, is not suited for the period of transition from the old to a completely new organization. Owen, the chief of the English Communists, would have the performance of specified duties allotted to men according to age, and the chief leaders of a government would be the oldest members of it. All socialists, with the exception of the followers of Fourier, to whom all forms of government are the same, are agreed that the form of government which is called the sovereignty of the people is a very unsuitable, and even dangerous, sheet anchor for the young principle of communism about to be realized. Weitling goes further. He will have nothing of democracy, even in a socialist community. If the idea of the sovereignty of the people is to be applied, all must rule. This can never be the case, and it is, therefore, not the sovereignty of the people, but the chance sovereignty of some of the people. Weitling wanted the greatest geniuses to govern. They would be selected in a competition by scientific assemblies. I have quoted Weitling in detail in order to show that the contempt for democracy, which is now recommended to us as the highest wisdom, is quite an old conception, and corresponds to a primitive stage in the working class movement. At the same time that Weitling poured scorn on universal suffrage and freedom of the press, the workers of England were fighting for these rights, and Marx and Engels ranged themselves by their side. Since then the working classes of the whole of Europe, in numerous, often bloody, struggles, have conquered one installment of democracy after the other, and by their endeavors to win, maintain, and extend democracy, and by constantly making use of each installment for organization, for propaganda, and for wresting social reforms, have they grown in maturity from year to year, and from the lowest have become the highest placed section of the masses of the people. Has the proletariat already attained the maturity which socialism postulates? And are the other conditions now in existence? These questions are today much disputed, the answers given being by some as decisively in the affirmative as by others in the negative. Both answers seem to me rather over hasty. Ripeness for socialism is not a condition which lends itself to statistical calculation before the proof can be put to the test. In any case, it is wrong, as so often happens in discussing this question, to put the material prerequisites of socialism too much in the foreground. No doubt, without a certain development of the large industry no socialism is possible, but when it is asserted that socialism would only become practicable when capitalism is no more in a position to expand, all proof of this is lacking. It is correct to say that socialism would be the more easily realizable the more developed the large industry is, and therefore the more compact the productive forces are which must be socially organized. Yet this is only relevant to the problem, when it is considered from the standpoint of a particular state. The simplification of the problem in this form is, however, counteracted by the fact that the growth of the large industry is accompanied by an expansion of its markets, the progress of the division of labor and of international communications, and therewith the constant widening and increasing complication of the problem of the social organization of production. There is, indeed, no reason for believing that the organization of the largest part of production for social ends, by the state, municipalities, and cooperative societies, is not already possible in modern industrial states, with their banking facilities and their machinery for the conduct of businesses. The decisive factor is no longer the material, but the personal one. Is the proletariat strong and intelligent enough to take in hand the regulation of society, that is, does it possess the power and the capacity to transfer democracy from politics to economics? This cannot be foretold with certainty. The factor in question is one which is in different stages of development in different countries, and it fluctuates considerably at various times in the same country. Adequate strength and capacity are relative conceptions. The same measure of strength may be insufficient today, when the opponents are strong, but tomorrow quite adequate, when they have suffered a moral, economic, or military collapse. The same measure of capacity might be quite inadequate today should power be attained in a highly complicated situation, and yet tomorrow it could be equal to all demands made on it, if meanwhile conditions have simplified and become stabler. In every case only practice can show if the proletariat is already sufficiently mature for socialism. We can only say the following for certain. The proletariat grows always in numbers, strength, and intelligence. It is ever approaching the climax of its development. It is not definite enough to say that the latter phase will be reached when the proletariat forms the majority of the people, and when the majority announce their adhesion to socialism. On the other hand, it may be confidently said that a people is not yet ripe for socialism so long as the majority of the masses are hostile to socialism, and will have nothing of it. So here again democracy not only matures the proletariat the soonest, but gives the quickest indications of this process. Chapter 4. The effects of democracy. The modern state is a rigidly centralist organism, an organization comprising the greatest power within modern society, and influencing in the most effective way the fate of each individual, as is especially obvious in time of war. The state is today what the family and community used to be for the individual. If communities were in their way democratically organized, the power of the state, on the contrary, including the bureaucracy and the army, looms over the people, even gaining such strength that at times it acquires an ascendancy over the classes which are socially and economically dominant, thus constituting itself an absolute government. Yet this latter condition is nowhere lasting. The absolute rule of bureaucracy leads to its ossification and its absorption into endless time-wasting formulae, and that just at the time when industrial capitalism is developing, when the revolutionary methods of production which arise from it subject all economic and social conditions to constant change, and impart a quicker movement to industrial life, thus requiring the speediest political adjustments. The absolute rule of bureaucracy, therefore, leads to arbitrariness and stultification, but a system of production like capitalism, in which each producer is dependent upon numerous others' needs for its prosperity, the security and legality of social relations. The absolute state gets into conflict with the productive forces, and becomes a fetter on them. It is, then, urgently necessary for the executive to be subjected to public criticism, for free organizations of citizens to counterbalance the power of the state, for self-government in municipalities and provinces to be established, for the power of lawmaking to be taken from the bureaucracy, and put under the control of a central assembly, freely chosen by the people, that is a parliament. The control of the government is the most important duty of parliament, and in this it can be replaced by no other institution. It is conceivable, though hardly practicable, for the lawmaking power to be taken from the bureaucracy, and entrusted to various committees of experts, which would draft the laws and submit them to the people for their decision. The activities of the executive can only be supervised by another central body, and not by an unorganized and formless mass of people. The attempts to overcome the absolute power of the state, as here described, are made by all classes in a modern state, with the exception of those which may share in its power, that is all except bureaucrats, court nobles, the state church, as well as the great bankers who do a lucrative business with the state. Before the united pressure of the other classes, which may include the landed gentry, the lower clergy, the industrial capitalists, the absolute regime must give way. In a greater or lesser degree it must concede freedom of the press, of public meeting, of organization, and a parliament. All the states of Europe have successfully passed through this development. Every class will, however, endeavor to shape the new form of the state in a manner corresponding to its particular interests. This attempt is especially manifested in the struggle over the character of the parliament, that is, in the fight for the franchise. The watchword of the lower classes, of the people, is universal suffrage. Not only the wage earner, but the small peasant and the petty bourgeoisie have an interest in the franchise. Everywhere and under all circumstances these classes form the great majority of the population. Whether the proletariat is the predominant class amongst these depends on the extent of the economic development, although this factor does not determine whether the proletariat comprises the majority of the population. The exploiters are always a small minority of the population. In the long run, no modern state can withstand the pressure of these classes, and anything short of general suffrage in our society today would be an absurdity. In capitalist society, with its constantly changing conditions, the classes cannot be stereotyped in fixed grooves. All social conditions are in a state of flux. A franchise based on status is consequently excluded. A class which is not organized as such is a formless fluctuating mass, whose exact boundaries it is quite impossible to mark. A class is an economic entity, not a legal one. Class membership is always changing. Many hand workers who, under the regime of small industry, think they are possessors, feel like proletarians under large industry, and are really proletarians even when for purposes of statistics they are included with the possessing classes and independent producers. There is also no franchise based on the census which would secure to the possessing classes a lasting monopoly of parliament. It would be upset by every depreciation in money values. Finally, a franchise based on education would be even more futile, in view of the progress of culture amongst the masses. Thus various factors combine to render general suffrage the only solution in the society of today, and bring the question more and more to the front. Above all, it is the only rational solution from the standpoint of the proletariat as the lowest class of the population. The most effective weapon of the proletariat is its numerical strength. It cannot emancipate itself until it has become the largest class of the population, and until capitalist society is so far developed that the small peasants and the petty bourgeoisie no longer overweight the proletariat. The proletariat has also an interest in the fact that the suffrage should not only be universal and equal, but also non-discriminatory, so that men and women, or wage earners and capitalists, do not vote in separate sections. Such a method would not only involve the danger that particular sections, who belong to the proletariat in reality, but are not wage earners in form, would be separated from it, but it would also have the still worse result of narrowing the outlook of the proletariat. For its great historical mission consists in the fact that the collective interests of society fall into line with its permanent class interests, which are not always the same thing as special sectional interests. It is a symptom of the maturity of the proletariat when its class consciousness is raised to the highest point by its grasp of large social relations and ends. This understanding is only made completely clear by scientific socialism, not only by theoretical teaching, but by the habit of regarding things as a whole instead of looking at special interests which are furthered and extended by engaging in political action. Confining the outlook to trade interests narrows the mind, and this is one of the drawbacks to mere trade unionism. Herein lies the superiority of the organization of the Social Democratic Party, and also the superiority of a non-discriminatory, as compared with a franchise which divides the electors into categories. In the struggle for the political rights referred to, modern democracy arises, and the proletariat matures. At the same time a new factor appears, viz., the protection of minorities, the opposition in the state. Democracy signifies rule of majority, but not less the protection of minorities. The absolute rule of bureaucracy strives to obtain for itself permanency. The forcible suppression of all opposition is its guiding principle. Almost everywhere it must do this to prevent its power being forcibly broken. It is otherwise with democracy, which means the rule of majorities. But majorities change. In a democracy no regime can be adapted to long duration. Even the relative strength of classes is not a fixed quantity, at least in the capitalist era. But the strength of parties changes even quicker than the strength of classes, and it is parties which aspire to power in a democracy. It must not here be forgotten, what so often happens, that the abstract simplification of theory, although necessary to a clear understanding of realities, is only true in the last resort, and between it and actualities there are many intervening factors. A class can rule, but not govern, for a class is a formless mass, while only an organization can govern. It is the political parties which govern in a democracy. A party is, however, not synonymous with a class, although it may, in the first place, represent a class interest. One and the same class interest can be represented in very different ways, by various tactical methods. According to their variety, the representatives of the same class interests are divided into different parties. Above all, the deciding factor is the position in relation to other classes and parties. Only seldom does a class dispose of so much power that it can govern the state by itself. If a class attains power, and finds that it cannot keep it by its own strength, it seeks for allies. If such allies are forthcoming, various opinions and standpoints prevail amongst the representatives of the dominant class interests. In this way, during the 18th century Whigs and Tories represented the same landed interest, but one party endeavored to further it by alliance with the bourgeoisie of the towns at the expense of the throne and its resources, while the other party conceived the monarchy to be its strongest support. Similarly today in England and also elsewhere, liberals and conservatives represent the same capitalist interests. But the one thinks they will be best served by an alliance with the landed class, and forcible suppression of the working classes, while the other fears dire consequences from this policy, and strives to conciliate the working classes by small concessions at the expense of the landed class. As with the socially and economically ruling classes and their parties, so it is with the aspiring class and its parties. Parties and classes are therefore not necessarily coterminous. A class can split up into various parties, and a party may consist of members of various classes. A class may still remain the rulers, while changes occur in the governing party, if the majority of the ruling class considers the methods of the existing governing party unsuitable, and that of its opponents to be more appropriate. Government by parties in a democracy changes more rapidly than the rule of classes. Under these circumstances, no party is certain of retaining power, and must always count on the possibility of being in the minority, but by virtue of the nature of the state no party need remain in a minority forever. These conditions account for the growing practice of protecting minorities in a democracy. The deeper the roots which a democracy has struck, and the longer it has lasted and influenced political customs, the more effective is the minority, and the more successfully it can oppose the pretensions of any party which seeks to remain in power at all costs. What significance the protection of minorities has for the early stages of the Socialist Party, which everywhere started as a small minority, and how much it has helped the proletariat to mature, is clear. In the ranks of the Socialist Party the protection of minorities is very important. Every new doctrine, be it of a theoretical or a tactical nature, is represented in the first place by minorities. If these are forcibly suppressed, instead of being discussed, the majority is spared much trouble and inconvenience. Much unnecessary labor might be saved. A doctrine does not mean progress because it is new and championed by a minority. Most of what arises as new thought has already been discussed long before, and recognized as untenable, either by practice or by refutation. Ignorance is always bringing out old wares as if they were something new. Other new ideas may be original, but put in a perverted shape. Although only a few of the new ideas and doctrines may spell real progress, yet progress is only possible through new ideas, which at the outset are put forward by minorities. The suppression of the new ideas of minorities in the party would only cause harm to the proletarian class struggle, and an obstacle to the development of the proletariat. The world is always bringing us against new problems, which are not to be solved by the existing methods. Tedious as it may be to sift the wheat from the chaff, this is an unavoidable task if our movement is not to stagnate, and is to rise to the height of the tasks before it. And what is needful for a party is also needful for the state. Protection of minorities is an indispensable condition for democratic development, and no less important than the rule of the majority. Another characteristic of democracy is here brought in view, which is the form it gives to the class struggle. In 1893 and in 1900 I have already discussed this matter, and give below some quotations from my writings. Freedom of combination and of the press and universal suffrage, under circumstances, even conscription, are not only weapons which are secured to the proletariat in the modern state by the revolutionary struggle of the bourgeoisie, but these institutions throw on the relative strength of parties and classes, and on the mental energy which vitalizes them a light which is absent in the time of absolutism. At that time the ruling, as well as the revolutionary, classes were fighting in the dark. As every expression of opposition was rendered impossible, neither the government nor the revolutionists were aware of their strength. Each of the two sides was thus exposed to the danger of overestimating its strength, so long as it refrained from measuring itself in a struggle with the opponent, and of underestimating its strength the moment it suffered a single defeat, and then threw its arms away. This is really one of the chief reasons why, in the revolutionary period of the bourgeoisie, so many institutions collapsed at one blow, and so many governments were overthrown at a single stroke, and it also explains all the vicissitudes of revolution and counter-revolution. It is quite different today, at least in countries which possess some measure of democratic government. These democratic institutions have been called the safety valve of society. It is quite false to say that the proletariat in a democracy ceases to be revolutionary, that it is contented with giving public expression to its indignation and its sufferings, and renounces the idea of social and political revolution. Democracy cannot remove the class antagonisms of capitalist society, nor prevent the overthrow of that society, which is their inevitable outcome. But if it cannot prevent the revolution, it can avoid many reckless and premature attempts at revolution, and render many revolutionary movements unnecessary. It gives a clear indication of the relative strength of classes and parties. It does not do away with their antagonism, nor does it avoid the ultimate outcome of their struggle, but it serves to prevent the rising classes from attempting tasks to which they are not equal, and it also restrains the ruling classes from refusing concessions when they no longer have the strength to maintain such refusal. The direction of evolution is not thereby altered, but the pace is made more even and steady. The coming to the front of the proletariat in a state with some measure of democratic government will not be marked by such a striking victory as attended the bourgeoisie in their revolutionary period, nor will it be exposed to a violent overthrow. Since the rise of the modern social democratic working class movement in the 60s, the European proletariat has only suffered one great defeat, in the Paris Commune of 1871. At the time France was still suffering from the consequences of the empire, which had withheld real democratic institutions from the people. The French proletariat had only attained to the slightest degree of class consciousness, and the revolt was provoked. The proletarian democratic method of conducting the struggle may seem to be a slower affair than the revolutionary period of the bourgeoisie. It is certainly less dramatic and striking, but it also exacts a smaller measure of sacrifice. This may be quite indifferent to the finely endowed literary people who find in socialism an interesting pastime, but not to those who really carry on the fight. This so-called peaceful method of the class struggle, which is confined to non-militant methods, parliamentarism, strikes, demonstrations, the press, and similar means of pressure, will retain its importance in every country according to the effectiveness of the democratic institutions which prevail there, the degree of political and economic enlightenment, and the self-mastery of the people. On these grounds, I anticipate that the social revolution of the proletariat will assume quite other forms than that of the bourgeoisie, and that it will be possible to carry it out by peaceful economic, legal, and moral means, instead of by physical force, in all places where democracy has been established. The above is my opinion today. Of course, Every institution has its bad side, and disadvantages can be discovered in democracy. Where the proletariat is without rights, it can develop no mass organization, and normally cannot promote mass action. There it is only possible for a handful of reckless fighters to offer lasting opposition to the governing regime. But this elite is daily confronted with the necessity of bringing the entire system to an end. Undistracted by the small demands of daily politics, the mind is concentrated on the largest problems, and learns constantly to keep in view the entire political and social relations. Only a small section of the proletariat takes part in the fight, but it cherishes keen theoretical interest, and is inspired by the great aims. Quite differently does democracy affect the proletariat, when it has only a few hours a day at its disposal under present-day conditions. Democracy develops mass organizations involving immense administrative work. It calls on the citizen to discuss and solve numerous questions of the day, often of the most trivial kind. The whole of the free time of the proletariat is more and more taken up with petty details, and its attention occupied by passing events. The mind is contracted within a narrow circle. Ignorance and even contempt of theory, opportunism in place of broad principles, tend to get the upper hand. Marx and Engels praised the theoretical mind of the German working class, in contrast with the workers of Western Europe and America. They would today find the same theoretical interest amongst the Russian workers, in comparison with the Germans. Nevertheless, everywhere the class-conscious proletariat and their representatives fight for the realization of democracy, and many of them have shed their life's blood for it. They know that without democracy nothing can be done. The stimulating results of the struggle with a despotism are confined to a handful, and do not touch the masses. On the other hand, the degenerating influence of democracy on the proletariat need not be exaggerated. Often is it the consequence of the lack of leisure from which the proletariat suffers, not of democracy itself. It were indeed extraordinary if the possession of freedom necessarily made men more narrow and trivial than its absence. The more democracy tends to shorten the working day, the greater the sum of leisure at the disposal of the proletariat, the more it is enabled to combine devotion to large problems with attention to necessary detail. And the impulse thereto is not lacking. For whatever democracy may be able to accomplish, it cannot resolve the antagonisms inherent in a capitalist system of production, so long as it refrains from altering the system. On the contrary, the antagonisms in capitalist society become more acute and tend to provoke bigger conflicts, in this way forcing great problems on the attention of the proletariat, and taking its mind off routine and detail work. Under democracy, this moral elevation is no longer confined to a handful, but is shared in by the whole of the people, who are at the same time gradually accustomed to self-government by the daily performance of routine work. Again, under democracy, the proletariat does not always think and talk of revolution, as under despotism. It may for years, and even decades, be immersed in detail work, but everywhere situations must arise which will kindle in it revolutionary thought and aspirations. When the people are roused to action under a democracy, there is less danger than under despotism that they have been prematurely provoked, or will waste their energy in futile efforts. When victory is achieved, it will not be lost, but successfully maintained. And that is better in the end than the mere nervous excitement of a fresh revolutionary drama. Chapter V. Dictatorship. Democracy is the essential basis for building up a socialist system of production. Only under the influence of democracy does the proletariat attain that maturity which it needs to be able to bring about socialism, and democracy supplies the surest means for testing its maturity. Between these two stages, the preparation for socialism and its realization, which both require democracy, there is the transition state when the proletariat has conquered political power, but has not yet brought about socialism in an economic sense. In this intervening period it is said that democracy is not only unnecessary, but harmful. This idea is not new. We have already seen it to be Whiteling's. But it is supposed to be supported by Karl Marx. In his letter criticizing the Gotha Party program, written in May, 1875, it is stated, between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. This requires a political transition stage, which can be nothing else than the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx had unfortunately omitted to specify more exactly what he conceived this dictatorship to be. Taken literally, the word signifies the suspension of democracy. But taken literally it also means the sovereignty of a single person, who is bound by no laws. A sovereignty which is distinguished from a despotism by being regarded as a passing phase, required by the circumstances of the moment, and not a permanent institution of the state. The expression dictatorship of the proletariat, that is the dictatorship not of a single person, but of a class, excludes the inference that Marx thought of dictatorship in the literal sense. He speaks in the passage above quoted not of a form of government, but of a condition which must everywhere arise when the proletariat has conquered political power. That he was not thinking of a form of government is shown by his opinion that in England and America the transition might be carried out peacefully. Of course, democracy does not guarantee a peaceful transition. But this is certainly not possible without democracy. However, to find out what Marx thought about the dictatorship of the proletariat, we need not have recourse to speculation. If in 1875 Marx did not explain in detail what he understood by the dictatorship of the proletariat, it might well have been because he had expressed himself on this matter a few years before, in his study of the Civil War in France. In that work, he wrote, "The Commune was essentially a government of the working class, the result of the struggle of the producing class against the appropriating class, the political form under which the freedom of labor could be attained being at length revealed." Thus the Paris Commune was, as Engels expressly declared in his introduction to the third edition of Marx's book, the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was, however, at the same time not the suspension of democracy, but was founded on its most thoroughgoing use, on the basis of universal suffrage. The power of the government was subjected to universal suffrage. The Commune was composed of town councillors, chosen by general suffrage in the various departments of Paris. Universal suffrage was to serve the people, constituted in communes, as individual suffrage serves every other employer in the search for the workmen and managers in his business. Marx constantly speaks here of the general suffrage of the whole people, and not of the votes of a specially privileged class. The dictatorship of the proletariat was for him a condition which necessarily arose in a real democracy, because of the overwhelming numbers of the proletariat. Marx must not, therefore, be sided by those who support dictatorship in preference to democracy. Of course, this does not prove it to be wrong. Only, it must be demonstrated on other grounds. In the examination of this question, dictatorship as a condition must not be confused with dictatorship as a form of government, which alone is a subject of dispute in our ranks. Dictatorship as a form of government means disarming the opposition, by taking from them the franchise, and liberty of the press and combination. The question is whether the victorious proletariat needs to employ these measures, and whether socialism is only or most easily realizable with their aid. It must next be noted that when we speak of dictatorship as a form of government, we cannot mean the dictatorship of a class. For, as already remarked, a class can only rule, not govern. If by dictatorship we do not merely signify a state of sovereignty, but a form of government, then dictatorship comes to mean that of a single person, or of an organization, not of the proletariat, but of a proletarian party. The problem is then complicated so soon as the proletariat itself is divided into various parties. The dictatorship of one of these parties is then no longer in any sense the dictatorship of the proletariat, but a dictatorship of one part of the proletariat over the other. The situation becomes still more complicated if the socialist parties are divided according to their relations to non-proletarian elements, and if perchance one party attains to power by an alliance of town proletarians and peasants, then the dictatorship becomes not merely a dictatorship of proletarians over proletarians, but of proletarian and peasants over proletarians. The dictatorship of the proletariat thus assumes a very peculiar form. What are the grounds for thinking that the sovereignty of the proletariat must necessarily take a form which is incompatible with democracy? Now it may be taken for granted that as an ill, the proletariat will only attain to power when it represents the majority of the population, or, at least, has the latter behind it. Next to its economic indispensability, the weapon of the proletariat in its political struggles is its huge numbers. It may only expect to carry the day against the resources of the ruling classes where it has the masses behind it. This was the opinion of Marx and Engels, and therefore they wrote in the Communist Manifesto, all previous movements were movements of minorities, and in the interests of minorities. The proletarian movement is the independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of that majority. This was true also of the Paris Commune. The first act of the new revolutionary regime was an appeal to the electors. The ballot, taken under conditions of the greatest freedom, gave strong majorities for the Commune in all districts of Paris. 65 revolutionaries were chosen, against 21 of the opposition, of whom 15 were distinct reactionaries, and 6 radical republicans of the Gambetta school. Among the 65 revolutionaries all the existing phases of French socialism were represented. However such they fought against each other, no one exercised a dictatorship over the others. A government so strongly supported by the masses has not the least occasion to interfere with democracy. It cannot dispense with the use of force when this is employed to suppress democracy. Force can only be met by force. But a government which knows that the masses are behind it would only use force to protect democracy, and not to subvert it. It would be committing suicide to cast aside such a strong support as universal suffrage, which is a powerful source of moral authority. The subversion of democracy by dictatorship can therefore only be a matter for consideration in exceptional cases, when an extraordinary combination of favorable circumstances enables a proletarian party to take to itself political power, while the majority of the people are either not on its side, or are even against it. Amongst a people who have been trained in politics for decades, and have run into party molds, such a chance victory is hardly possible. It is only likely in very backward conditions. If in such a case universal suffrage goes against the socialist government, is the latter now to do what we have hitherto demanded of every government, viz., to bow to the will of the people, and to resume its struggle for the power of the state with confidence, on the basis of democracy, or is it to subvert democracy in order to hold on to power? How can a dictatorship remain at the helm against the will of the majority of the people? Two ways suggest themselves, that of Jesuitism or that of Bonapartism. We have already referred to the Jesuit state in Paraguay. The means by which the Jesuits there maintained their authority was their enormous mental superiority to the natives organized by them, who without them were helpless. Can a socialist party acquire such a superiority in a European state? This is quite out of the question. No doubt the proletariat, in the course of the class struggle, raises its mental stature until it is higher than that of other workers, such as peasants, but not without the latter acquiring a political interest and understanding at the same time. The chasm between these various classes is by no means an unbridgeable one. Alongside of the classes of hand workers grows a section of intellectuals, which tends to become more numerous and increasingly necessary for the productive system. Their vocation calls for the acquisition of knowledge and the exercise and development of intelligence. This section occupies a middle place between the proletariat and the capitalist class. It is not directly interested in capitalism, but is nevertheless mistrustful of the proletariat, so long as it does not consider the latter to be capable of taking its fate into its own hands. Even such members of the cultured classes as most warmly espouse the cause of the freedom of the proletariat stand aloof from the labor movement in the early stages of the class struggle. They only change their attitude when the proletariat shows increasing capacity in its struggles. The confidence in the proletariat, which is thus inspired in intellectuals who enter the socialist movement, is not to be confused with the trust which, since August 4, 1914, the Liberal and Centre parties, and even the government of Germany, have placed in the governmental socialists. The first kind of confidence is bred by the conviction that the proletariat has acquired the strength and capacity to free itself. The second sort of confidence comes with the conviction that the socialists in question no longer take the proletariat's fight for freedom seriously. Without the help, or in opposition to the intellectuals, socialist production cannot be instituted. In circumstances where the majority of the population mistrust the proletarian party, or stand aloof from it, this attitude would be shared by the bulk of the intellectuals. In that case, a victorious proletarian party would not only be without great intellectual superiority to the rest of the people, but would even be inferior to its opponents in this regard, although its outlook in general social matters might be a much higher one. The method of Paraguay is therefore not practicable in Europe. There remains to be considered the method adopted by Napoleon I on Brumaire 1799, and his nephew, the third Napoleon, on December 2, 1862. This consists in governing by the aid of the superiority of a centralist organization to the unorganized masses of the people, and the superiority of military power, arising from the fact that the armed forces of the government is opposed to a people who are defenseless or tired of the armed struggle. Can a socialist system of production be built up on this foundation? This means the organization of production by society, and requires economic self-government throughout the whole mass of the people. State organization of production by a bureaucracy, or by the dictatorship of a single section of the people, does not mean socialism. Socialism presupposes that broad masses of the people have been accustomed to organization, that numerous economic and political organizations exist, and can develop in perfect freedom. The socialist organization of labor is not an affair of barracks. A dictatorship of a minority which grants to the people the fullest freedom of organization undermines its own power by so doing. Should it seek, on the other hand, to maintain its authority by restricting this freedom, it impedes development towards socialism, instead of furthering it. A minority dictatorship always finds its most powerful support in an obedient army, but the more it substitutes this for majority support, the more it drives the opposition to seek a remedy by an appeal to the bayonet, instead of an appeal to that vote which is denied them. Civil war becomes the method of adjusting political and social antagonisms. Where complete political and social apathy or dejection does not prevail, the minority dictatorship is always threatened by armed attack, or constant guerrilla warfare, which easily develops into a protracted armed rising of great masses, to cope with which all the military power of the dictatorship is needed. The dictatorship is then involved in civil war, and lives in constant danger of being overthrown. To the building up of a socialist society there is no greater obstacle than internal war. In the present state of extensive geographical division of labor, the big industries are everywhere closely dependent on the security of communications no less than on the security of contract. External war would shake the socialist society to its foundations, even if the enemy did not penetrate into the country. Russian socialists of all sections in the present revolution are right in urging the necessity of peace for the rebuilding of society. Yet civil war is far more harmful to a socialist society than external war, as civil war is fought out in the land itself, and wastes and paralyses as much as a foreign invasion. In the struggles of states it is usually only a question of an accession or loss of power on the part of one or the other government, and not a matter of their very existence. After the war the various belligerent governments and people seek to live in peace, if not in amity. The parties in a civil war are quite differently related to each other. They do not carry on the war to wrest some concessions from the opponents, and then to live with them in peace. And a civil war is also different from democracy, under which minorities are so protected that any party which finds itself in this position, and is obliged to renounce hopes of being the government, need not relinquish political activity. Every party which is reduced to a minority always retains the right to strive to become the majority, and thereby take over the government. In a civil war each party fights for its existence, and the vanquished is menaced with complete destruction. The consciousness of this fact accounts for civil wars being so terrible. A minority which only retains control by military power is inclined to crush its opponents by the bloodiest means, and to decimate them in reckless slaughter, when it is threatened by a revolt, and succeeds in repressing it. June, 1848, in Paris, and the bloody May week of 1871 have shown this with terrible distinctness. Chronic civil war, or its alternative under a dictatorship, the apathy and lethargy of the masses, would render the organization of a socialist system of production as good as impossible. And yet the dictatorship of the minority, which either produces civil war or apathy, is to be the sovereign means for effecting the transition from capitalism to socialism. Many people confuse civil war with the social revolution, considering this to be its form, and are therefore prepared to excuse the acts of force inevitable in a civil war. This has always been the case in revolutions, they say, and ever will be. We Social Democrats are decidedly not of the opinion that that which has been must always be. Such ideas of the revolution are formed on the examples of previous bourgeois revolutions. The proletarian revolution will be accomplished under quite different conditions from these. The bourgeois revolutions broke out in states in which a despotism, supported by an army separated from the people, suppressed all free movements, in which freedom of the press, of public meeting, of organization, and general suffrage did not exist, and in which there was no real representation of the people. There the struggle against the government necessarily took the form of a civil war. The proletariat of today will, as regards Western Europe at least, attain to power in states in which a certain measure of democracy, if not pure democracy, has been deeply rooted for decades, and also in which the military are not so cut off from the people as formerly. It remains to be seen how the conquest of political power by the proletariat is achieved under these conditions, where it represents the majority of the people. In no case need we anticipate that in Western Europe the course of the Great French Revolution will be repeated. If present-day Russia exhibits so much likeness to the France of 1793, that only shows how near it stands to the stage of bourgeois revolution. The social revolution, the political revolution, and civil war must be distinguished from each other. The social revolution is a profound transformation of the entire social structure brought about by the establishment of a new method of production. It is a protracted process, which may be spread over decades, and no definite boundaries can be drawn for its conclusion. It will be the more successful, according to the peaceful nature of the forms under which it is consummated. Civil and foreign wars are its deadly foes. As a rule, a social revolution is brought about by a political revolution, through a sudden alteration in the relative strength of classes in the state, whereby a class hitherto excluded from the political power possesses itself of the machinery of government. The political revolution is a sudden act, which is rapidly concluded. Its forms depend on the constitution of the state in which it is accomplished. The more democracy rules, not merely formally, but actually anchored in the strength of the working classes, the greater is the likelihood that the political revolution will be a peaceful one. Contrariwise, the more the system which has hitherto prevailed has been without the support of a majority of the people, and has represented a minority which kept control by military force, the greater is the likelihood that the political revolution will take the form of a civil war. Yet, even in the last case, the supporters of the social revolution have a pressing interest in seeing that the civil war is only a transitory episode which quickly terminates, that it is made to serve the sole end of introducing and setting up democracy, to whose pace the social revolution should be adapted. In other words, the social revolution must not, for the time being, be carried out farther than the majority of the people are inclined to go, because beyond this the social revolution, desirable as it may seem to far-seeing individuals, would not find the necessary conditions for establishing itself permanently. But did not the reign of terror of the proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie of Paris, that is the dictatorship of a minority, in the Great French Revolution, bring with it enormous consequences of the highest historical significance? Of course. But of what kind were they? That dictatorship was a child of the war which the allied monarchs of Europe had waged against revolutionary France. To have victoriously beaten off this attack was the historical achievement of the Reign of Terror. Thereby is again proved distinctly the old truth, that dictatorship is better able to wage war than democracy. It proves in no way that dictatorship is the method of the proletariat to carry through social transformations to its own liking, and to keep control of political power. In energy the Reign of Terror of 1793 cannot be surpassed. Yet the proletariat of Paris did not succeed, by this means, in retaining power. The dictatorship was a method by means of which the various fractions belonging to proletarian and petty bourgeois politics fought amongst themselves, and, finally, it was the means of making an end of all proletarian and petty bourgeois politics. The dictatorship of the lower classes opens the way for the dictatorship of the sword. Should it be said, after the example of the bourgeois revolutions, that the revolution is synonymous with civil war and dictatorship, then the consequences must also be recognized, and it must be added the revolution would necessarily end in the rule of a Cromwell or a Napoleon. This is, however, by no means the necessary upshot of a proletarian revolution where the proletariat forms the majority of the nation, which is democratically organized, and only in such cases do the conditions for socialist production exist. By the dictatorship of the proletariat we are unable to understand anything else than its rule on the basis of democracy. Chapter 6. Constituent Assembly and Soviet. The contrast between democracy and dictatorship has just acquired an important significance in the Russian Revolution. The socialists of Russia were from the first divided. They comprised social revolutionaries and Marxists. The social revolutionaries were, in the first place, the representatives of the peasantry, which in Russia, in contrast to all the rest of Europe, were still a revolutionary factor, and therefore could march with the socialist proletariat. Against the social revolutionaries were the Marxists, the representatives of the industrial proletariat. These divided into two sections, the Mensheviks, who held that only a bourgeois revolution was possible in the existing economic conditions in Russia, unless the revolution coincided with a European socialist revolution, and the Bolsheviks, who always believed in the omnipotence of will and force, and now, without considering the backwardness of Russia, are trying to shape the revolution on socialist lines. In the course of the revolution the contrast became more acute. The Mensheviks considered it to be their task to take part in a provisional coalition government until the duly constituted National Assembly had formed a definite government. The Bolsheviks endeavored, even before the meeting of the National Assembly, to overthrow this provisional government, and replace it by government of their party. An additional ground of opposition came with the question of peace. The Mensheviks wanted immediate peace as much as the Bolsheviks, both wanted it on the basis of Zimmerwald, no annexations or indemnities. Both sections had been represented at Zimmerwald, and the Mensheviks had been in the majority there. But the Mensheviks wanted a general peace, and all belligerents to adopt the watchword, no annexations or indemnities. So bug as this was not achieved, the Russian army should keep their arms in readiness. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, demanded immediate peace at any price, and were ready, if necessary, to conclude a separate peace, and they sought to enforce their views by increasing the already great disorganization of the army. They were supported by the war weariness of great masses in the army and among the people, as well as by the apparent inactivity of the provisional government, which, however, accomplished far more political and social reform than any other bourgeois government in the same period, although it did not do as much as would be expected of a revolutionary government. The elections for the Constituent Assembly could not be so rapidly completed as was desired. It was first necessary to renew the old official machinery, and to create democratic town and country representation. Enormous difficulties were met with in the compilation of voters' lists in the giant empire, whose census took place in 1897. So the elections to the Constituent Assembly were constantly postponed. Above all, peace was no nearer. Wherever the guilt for this may rest, the statesmen of the Entente did not understand how necessary it was for themselves at that time to pronounce in favor of no annexations or indemnities. They pursued a policy which made the Entente appear to the Russian people the obstacle to peace, and with them their allies the provisional government. This was the reason why some of the Mensheviks, the internationalists, demanded separation from the Entente, and went in opposition to the provisional government. Yet they did not go so far as the Bolsheviks. Under these circumstances, the Bolsheviks gained ground at the expense of the Mensheviks and the provisional government which they succeeded in overthrowing in November, 1917. Their propaganda zeal proved to be so great that they were able to draw a part of the social revolutionaries to their side. The left social revolutionaries henceforth marched with the Bolsheviks, into whose government they entered, while the right and also the center remained on the side of the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks drew their strength from the great expectations which they raised. If they were to retain this strength, they had to fulfill these expectations. Was that possible? The Bolshevist revolution was based on the supposition that it would be the starting point of a general European revolution, and that the bold initiative of Russia would summon the proletariat of all Europe to rise. On these suppositions, it was of no moment what form was taken by the Russian separate peace, what humiliations and burdens it placed on the Russian people, and what interpretations it gave to the principle of the self-determination of peoples. And it was also a matter of indifference whether Russia was capable of defense or not. According to this theory, the European Revolution formed the best defense of the Russian Revolution, for it would bring to the peoples in territory hitherto Russian real and complete self-determination. The revolution which would bring about socialism in Europe would also be the means of removing the obstacles to the carrying through of socialism in Russia which are created by the economic backwardness of that country. This was all very logically thought out, and quite well founded, provided the supposition was granted, that the Russian Revolution must inevitably unchain the European Revolution. But what if this did not happen? The supposition has not yet been realized. And now the proletariat of Europe is blamed for leaving the Russian Revolution in the lurch, and betraying it. This is a complaint against unknown people, for who can be made responsible for the inactivity of the European proletariat? It is an old Marxist saying that revolutions cannot be made, but arise out of conditions. The conditions of Western Europe are, however, so different from those of Russia that a revolution there would not necessarily provoke one here. When the revolution of 1848 broke out in France, it immediately spread over that part of Europe lying east of it. It, however, halted at the Russian boundaries, and when the revolution was unchained in Russia in 1905, it provoked strong suffrage movements in the countries to the west, although nothing that could be described as a revolution. But the Bolsheviks must not be too much blamed for expecting a European revolution. Other socialists did the same, and we are certainly approaching conditions which will sharply accentuate the class struggle, and which may have many surprises in store. And if the Bolsheviks have up till now been in error in expecting a revolution, have not Babel, Marx, and Engels cherished a like delusion? This is not to be denied. But the latter have never had in mind a revolution at a specific time, and never elaborated their tactics in such wise that the existence of the party and the progress of the class struggle was made to be dependent on the outbreak of the revolution, so that the proletariat was confronted with the dilemma, revolution or bankruptcy. Like all politicians, they too have erred in their expectations. But such errors have never set them on a false track, and led them into a cul-de-sac. Our Bolshevist comrades have staked all on the card of the general European Revolution. As this card has not turned up, they were forced into a course which brought them up against insoluble problems. They had to defend Russia without an army against powerful and implacable enemies. They had to establish a regime of well-being for all in a state of general dislocation and impoverishment. The less the material and intellectual conditions existed for all that they aspired to, the more they felt obliged to replace what was lacking by the exercise of naked power, by dictatorship. They had to do this all the more the greater the opposition to them amongst the masses became. So it became inevitable that they should put dictatorship in the place of democracy. If the Bolsheviks were deceived in their expectations that they only needed to become the government, in order to unchain the European Revolution, they were not less so in the anticipation that they had, only to grasp the helm of state, and the majority of the population would joyously range themselves behind them. As the opposition under the conditions due to Russia's situation, they had indeed developed great propaganda strength, as we have already noted. At the beginning of the revolution only a small handful, they became so strong eventually as to seize the power of the state. But had they the masses of the population behind them? This should have been revealed by the Constituent Assembly, which the Bolsheviks, like other revolutionaries, had demanded, and for a period even violently demanded, the Constituent Assembly, to be chosen by universal, equal, direct, and secret suffrage. Immediately after the capture of the government by the Bolsheviks, the new regime was confirmed by the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, albeit in opposition to a strong minority, which left the Congress protesting. But even the majority did not yet repudiate the idea of the Constituent Assembly. The resolution confirming the Soviet government began with the words, pending the calling together of the Constituent Assembly, a provisional workers' and peasants' government is to be formed, which is to be called the Council of People's Commissaries. The Constituent Assembly then is recognized here as taking precedence of the Council of People's Commissaries. On November 3 the government dissolved the Town Council of Petrograd on the ground that it was in conflict with the outlook of the people, as manifested by the revolution of November 7, and by the elections to the Constituent Assembly. The new members were proclaimed on the basis of the existing general franchise. Soon, however, a defect was discovered in the elections to the Constituent Assembly. On December 7, the All-Russian Executive Committee of Soviets published a resolution, in which it was stated, however the electoral arrangements of a body composed of elected representatives may be devised, these can only be considered to be truly democratic and really to represent the will of the people, when the right of recalling their members by the electors is recognized and exercised. This principle of real democracy applies to all representative bodies and also to the Constituent Assembly. The Congress of the Councils of Workmen's, Soldiers' and Peasants' delegates, who are chosen on equal grounds, has the right to issue writs for a new election in the case of town and parish councils, and other representative bodies, not excluding the Constituent Assembly. On the demand of more than half of the electors of the circumscription in question, the council must order a new election. The demand that the majority of the voters may at any time recall a deputy, who is no longer in agreement with their views, is entirely in accordance with the principles of democracy. But it is not clear, from this standpoint, why the Soviets should take the step of ordering new elections. However, at that time this represented the widest interference with the Constituent Assembly that had been made. Neither the establishment of the Assembly, nor the elections were touched. But it was becoming ever clearer that the elections had not given the Bolsheviks the majority. Therefore, the Pravda of December 26, 1917, published a number of propositions relating to the Constituent Assembly, which Lenin had drawn up, and the Central Committee had accepted. One of them declared that the elections had taken place shortly after the victory of the Bolsheviks, but before the social revolutionaries had yet divided. The left and the right social revolutionaries had therefore had a common list of candidates. Consequently, the elections gave no clear indication of the real voice of the masses. Whoever entertained this view, in face of the above-mentioned proposition of December 7, was committed to the conclusion that new elections should be ordered to the Assembly in districts which had chosen social revolutionaries. To what other end had this resolution been drawn up? Yet on December 26 it was already forgotten. And suddenly quite another song was heard in the other proposition of Lenin, with which we are here concerned. After he had shown us that the assembly just elected was not suitable, because it did not express the real voice of the whole people, be declared that any assembly elected by the masses by general suffrage was not suitable, the Soviet Republic represents not only a higher form of democratic institutions, in comparison with the bourgeois republic and the constituent assembly as its consummation, it is also the sole form which renders possible the least painful transition to socialism. It is only a pity that this knowledge was arrived at after one had been left a minority in the constituent assembly. Conflict with the assembly was now inevitable. It ended with a victory for the Soviets, whose dictatorship as a permanent form of government in Russia was proclaimed. Chapter 7. The Soviet Republic. The Soviet organization was a product of the Russian Revolution of 1905. At that time the proletariat engaged in mass action, for which it required a form of mass organization.